So today we'll be ranking fantasy maps based on their realism, and by we I mean me, and by ranking I mean vaguely categorizing. I should probably open by explaining my tier system. I'm not using the standard S, A, B, C, D, F tier list. Instead, I'll be using my own tiers, which are actually realistic, meaning the map has very few issues with realism, looks realistic but isn't, meaning at first glance the map looks plausible, but then as you look closer things start getting a bit weird. Zero realism in a trench coat, meaning the map looks like it's trying really hard to be realistic. It's trying so hard. But there are so many absurdities that it makes absolutely no sense. Then we have unashamedly nonsense, meaning the map very clearly knows what it is, and that is an insane blob of fantasy shenanigans. And finally, warped Earth, meaning the map took a landmass or multiple landmasses on Earth and played with them a little bit, but it's still pretty clear where those shapes came from. I want to make it clear, going into this, that there's absolutely nothing wrong with a fantasy map being unrealistic, and this video is just a fun experiment to demonstrate the diversity that's possible in fantasy maps. So let's get to the maps, in order of the names of image files on my computer. So first up we have Alagaesia from the Inheritance Cycle. The first thing I see is a desert in a place that makes absolutely no sense. How was this desert formed? It's clearly not so far inland that the rain can't get there, like the Mongolian desert. It's not a rain shadow desert because it doesn't go all the way up to the mountain range in the west. And it's not a coastal desert because, well, it's not on a coast. So I genuinely have no idea how it got there. The coastal mountain range is good. Those are usually formed by oceanic plates subducting under continental plates. The big blob of mountains in the bottom right, on the other hand, why? Just why? Mountains don't do that. The rivers are mostly fine, since like most people, Paolini clearly understands that gravity's gonna grav. There are two rivers I do find a little strange though, which are the Anora and the Beartooth. The Beartooth, I can't tell where it's going to or from, and the Anora should really go through the valley that Carvahall is in and not weirdly around the mountains. I get it though, that's where the town's name goes. That's just how it is in fantasy worlds. They all have giant letters 1,000 times the size of the Hollywood sign in every town and city. Anyway, the vast majority of settlements look like they have some kind of access to water, but none of them seem to actually be placed strategically. For example, why did no one build a city on Wodark Lake to control the gap through the mountains? Anyway, that's enough of me bullying the map. Time to give it a rating, and that rating is going to be zero realism in a trench coat. It looks like it tried to be realistic, but did not succeed in any measure. Next, we have Discworld from Discworld by Terry Pratchett. You'd think that I'd immediately put this in the unashamedly nonsense tier, and you'd be right. But it also belongs in another tier. That big landmass at the bottom? Australia turned on its side. The one connected to it by an isthmus? North America. The tiny little one in the top right corner? South America. This is unashamedly nonsense, but it's also warped Earth. It's the only map on this list that falls into two categories, and that's a very Discworld thing for Discworld to do. Now for Middle-earth from Lord of the Rings. Initially, when you look at this map, you're just like, yeah, seems reasonable. Then you notice a few anomalies. First of all, the strange eye-shaped mountains in the middle of the continent. I do get that though. Thematically, it borders the story. Mountains bordering the story is something we'll find is extremely common throughout these maps. Alagaesia did it too a couple of maps ago. You also have the very weird river delta where the Entwash flows into the Anduin. The topography of the area is definitely sloped, or else the Anduin wouldn't still be doing its thing. So I have to question how the area where the Entwash meets the Anduin is flat enough to form a delta, but the Anduin somehow doesn't become a bearded river in the area. If you've watched my video on how to build a planet, then you know the mountains around Mordor are literally the Carpathians, so no issue there. Then the biomes are all just grassland and forest because Tolkien was a big fan of everything looking like Europe, and Europe is very much forest and grassland, except Scandinavia and Spain, but everything else. Then all the populations are pretty well thought out in terms of resources and strategy. Middle-earth goes in looks realistic, but isn't. Then it's going to be Narnia, from the Chronicles of Narnia. Like Middle-earth, very European with grassland and forest everywhere. Unlike Middle-earth, the mountains all look like they could be there. Although, to be fair, the theory of plate tectonics wasn't widely accepted until 1967, so Tolkien does get a pass on his weird mountains. Anyway, back to Narnia. The rivers of the continent all look like they're having a good time with their old friend gravity, and the river deltas are on the coast, where they should be. The placement of Cair Paravel makes sense, at the mouth of the river, which would give easy access to water and would be ideally placed to control trade from across the sea. Anvard also makes sense. Pressing a population against a mountain makes it more defensible, and reasonably there could be water from melting ice or snow at the tops of the mountains. Then you have the Witch's Castle, which I think is in a really good spot, at the source of a river where water can be easily accessed, and the witch can very easily poison everyone else's water supply if she's feeling especially villainous that day. The only things I really question are the frozen lake and the frozen waterfall in the middle of the continent, but I can give them a pass due to being right next to Father Christmas. Narnia is the only map on this list that earns its place in the actually realistic tier. And spoilers for the upcoming ones, I guess. Next, it's Oz from Wizard of Oz. None of the mountains make sense, the rivers don't seem to be going anywhere, and the whole of Oz is a rectangle surrounded by a giant desert. Yes, obviously this is unashamedly nonsense, and there's nothing wrong with that. Now we have Roshar from the Stormlight Archive. I mean, come on, it's a continent in the shape of a storm, with absolutely no regard for the realistic placement of mountains or biomes. The rivers and populations do make sense though, which is a nice touch in a map that is otherwise unashamedly nonsense. You do you, Sanderson. Then it's Tamriel from the Elder Scrolls series. At first glance, it looks great. Forests in the south fade into grasslands, which fade into some deserts. Then we look at the mountains around Skyrim and the desert of Elsewhere and start wondering, how the hell did those things get there? It should be pointed out that this thing that's styled as a river is not actually a river, but rather the borders of all of the provinces, which is why I'm not calling it out on being the dumbest river ever drawn. Otherwise, I absolutely would. The placement of cities also makes sense, with cities like Bruma and Riften guarding gaps in mountain ranges, and every city looking like it has reasonably easy access to water. Tamriel gets to go into looks realistic but isn't. Time for Westeros from A Song of Ice and Fire. It's Britain backwards. There's no beating around that. It's literally just Britain flipped over and slightly warped. Then Essos, if you can find a full map of it, is a warped Turkey. This is a warped Earth, which makes sense given the books are heavily inspired by real-world history. Second to last, we have the Westlands from Wheel of Time. Once again, it's a mountain range bordering the story on a west coast. Clearly the mountains make no sense. The desert on the south coast is also very much in the wrong place. It should realistically be higher on the west coast, or not there at all if the continent is supposed to be somewhat European with a Gulf Stream-like current keeping it warm and wet. There's probably a better map of the Westlands out there, but this one is really hard to interpret. So until I have a map in front of me where I can easily make out the rivers and populations, this is going in zero realism in a trench coat. Finally, we have the unnamed continent on the unnamed planet from The Witcher, who does have a name. And after today, I am going to throw something at someone if I see another West Coast map with mountains bordering the story and biomes reminiscent of Europe. You know what? I am not even going to give this map a fair analysis. I'm just going to put it in zero realism in a trench coat because it makes me sad. And that's what happens to every West Coast map with mountains bordering the story from now on. Trench coats For all of you, nothing but trench coats. You have made me so sad that all I can do is trench coat you. Now get out of my sight. That's my tier list of 10 well-known fantasy maps. What do you think of my rankings, and where would you rank other fantasy maps?